Hi, and welcome to St. Peter's in Hove, and a very happy Easter season to you all. Today is Easter Wednesday. I'm going to be doing in the next few days a series of reflections on a rather important aspect of life, and indeed religious life, funerals. And we'll see how it goes. Each one will be about 5 minutes. I've read that the current form of funeral dates back to the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920. In the Victorian era, the funeral was a very elaborate thing. But during the Spanish flu, because there were so many funerals, because hearses were more or less queuing up to get into cemeteries, funerals became simplified because they had to be conducted more quickly. That's interesting, I'm sure you'll think. So the form of funeral that we've had until now dates from about 1920. However, with the current pandemic and of COVID, funerals seem to have changed again. What's happened possibly is just a speeding up of changes that were already underway. But speaking to people in the funeral business, speaking to people at my local crematorium, and also speaking to undertakers, I've discovered that a large amount of funerals in the last year have been, in fact, conducted completely without ceremony. In other words, they didn't really have funerals. Let's say the person died, the person was placed in a coffin by the undertakers, driven up to the crematorium, and consigned, committed, without any religious person being present or even any secular person being present, apart from the undertakers, who would have seen that everything would have been done properly, would have disposed of the body properly. In other words, without ceremony, direct cremation, it's usually called. So that is a new thing. It has been done in the past, but it was quite rare. Now I believe it's a considerable percentage of all people who die have direct cremation. Also growing, long before the pandemic, were secular funerals, where you have somebody who comes and says a few words, conducts some sort of ceremony, says some words, listens to some music, makes a reflection on the person's life, and then commits them to be cremated, or sometimes to be buried. That sort of thing is, of course, the job of a humanist celebrant or possibly some sort of non-denominational person who will do a sort of funeral which may have religious elements in it as well, though the humanists wouldn't. These non-religious funerals, i.e. funerals without clergy present, are certainly growing, and sometimes they may be 20-30% of all funerals, modern funerals. In certain cases, the undertaker himself will undertake to preside at the funeral ceremony, but not necessarily a cleric. Until fairly recently, almost everyone had a religious funeral, even if that funeral was done by a vicar or a priest that they'd never met. But nevertheless, a vicar or a priest was called in, and the vicar and the priest knew what to do. And of course, the Anglican Church provides people with a beautiful funeral service, which was very, very familiar to many people. And of course, there were three types of funeral in Britain anyway. There was Anglican, Nonconformist, and Catholic. If you go into any cemetery that's been there for some time, you'll find, usually in a state of abandonment, three chapels. One on the left, one on the right, Nonconformist Anglican, and then somewhere else you'll find the Roman Catholic one. That actually is something to look out for. Although these chapels have now been more or less abandoned, they're used for other things, and funerals take place in churches, and then you go to the cemetery or the crematorium. But once upon a time, it was quite common just to go up to the cemetery with the hearse and stop off at one of these chapels, have a funeral service, and then proceed to the graveside, which is interesting. Now, funerals, therefore, are in a state of flux, and this means essentially people have more choice. What sort of funeral do you want? Do you want a religious funeral? Do you want a funeral in church? Do you want just a religious funeral at the graveside or in a crematorium? Or do you just want direct cremation no bother, nothing at all, no funeral, in fact. We all have to die, but not all of us have to have a funeral. There's no legal requirement to have a funeral. Some people like the idea of somebody witnessing that everything is done properly, but that can be done by the undertakers. Well, we'll continue this discussion tomorrow. Happy Easter until then. All the very best.